Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive with us. So today we're going to be looking at a figure from the book of Acts, a guy named Ananias.
Ananias.
And you know what, honestly, that name might not ring a bell right away for a lot of people. But that's kind of what makes this deep dive so interesting.
Right.
We're going to be using a couple of Korean religious texts
Mm-hmm.
and even a sermon as our sources here, which, that already adds kind of a unique layer to things. And trust me, this is going to be anything UTT, some boring history lesson. We're going to be uncovering the surprising influence that one seemingly ordinary person can have and how that connects to all of us, even today.
What's fascinating about Ananias is that he pops up in the story of Saul's conversion to Christianity.
Yeah.
Saul, who later, of course, becomes the super famous Apostle Paul. But at this point in the story, Saul was actually known for persecuting Christians.
Yeah.
So just try to imagine the shock when God tells Ananias, who is a disciple just living in Damascus, to go find Saul and heal him.
Well, okay, hold on. For those of us who maybe need a quick refresher, who exactly was Saul at this point? What made him so feared among those early Christians?
Okay, so Saul. He was basically public enemy number one to the early Christians.
Okay.
He was actively hunting them down, imprisoning them, and even participating in some of their executions.
Wow.
So his name was basically synonymous with danger and persecution at that time.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like this was not someone you wanted to cross paths with. So God tells Ananias to go heal this guy. That's a pretty big ask.
It is.
I mean, that'd be like, I don't know, being told to go shake hands with the person that's been making your life miserable.
Exactly. And what's amazing is that the text actually tells us Ananias tries to argue with God about it.
He does it.
He does.
Right.
He's basically like, Lord, come on. Everyone knows this guy's reputation. He's been terrorizing your people in Jerusalem. And now he's here in Damascus with the authority to arrest anyone who believes in you. Are you sure you want me to go see him?
So I can only imagine the fear and doubt going through his mind.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, he's probably thinking, am I going to be the next one on Saul's hit list?
Yeah.
But it's also what makes him such a relatable figure, right? He's not just blindly obeying. He's grappling with a really difficult situation.
Absolutely. And it's that very human element that makes this story so powerful.
Yeah.
Ananias shows us that faith isn't about the absence of doubt. It's about choosing to trust, even when we're afraid.
And that choice to trust, despite his fear, ends up having these huge consequences. I mean, seriously, think about it. Without Ananias, there's no Apostle Paul.
Right.
And without Paul, the spread of Christianity could have looked very different. That's a pretty big ripple effect.
Yeah, it really makes you think about the impact of our actions.
It does.
And how even what might seem like small acts of obedience can have unintended consequences that reach far beyond ourselves.
Okay, so let's bring in the perspective from the Korean sermon we have here. It's interesting how this pastor is bringing Ananias' story to life centuries later and connecting it to a contemporary event, a funeral service for a woman named Won-sik.
Yeah, the sermon highlights how Ananias' experience still resonates even today. The pastor draws 4 key takeaways from Ananias' actions: the importance of family, fighting the good fight, leading others to faith, and living a life of faith.
Okay, let's break these down a little bit, starting with family. The sermon seems to be drawing this parallel between the way one person can influence many, like Ananias in the early church, with the impact someone like Won-sik had on her family and community.
Right. The sermon uses the phrase Ananiah, which means good fight, to describe facing life's challenges with faith. And this ties back to both Ananias and Won-sik, choosing to persevere even when things were tough.
It's interesting to think about how this concept of fighting the good fight might resonate differently in Korean culture compared to Western perspectives.
Yeah, it's a great point.
Could you maybe elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, so in Korean culture, there's this really strong emphasis on resilience and perseverance. And it's often rooted in this collective sense of responsibility and duty. So Aenye isn't just about individual struggle. It's about standing firm in your beliefs and commitments, even when you're facing hardship, and doing it for the betterment of the community or a greater cause. And that really resonates with Ananias' story, because his act of obedience ultimately contributed to the growth and spread of the early church.
Okay, so going back to the sermon, what about this idea of leading others to faith?
So the sermon emphasizes the importance of sharing your faith and uses Ananias bringing Saul into the Christian community as a prime example. And then you have living a life of faith. It's about leaving a positive impact on those around you.
Just like Ananias did with Paul, right? I mean, his influence ended up touching countless lives.
Yeah, and it's not always about these big grand gestures or dramatic moments. It's really about consistently trying to live in alignment with your faith.
You know, it's interesting how the sermon focuses on Ananias being kind of obscure. Like his name only shows up for a second in the Bible, yet he plays this huge role in this major turning point for Christianity.
It's true. The sermon uses that to make a really important point. It's that faithfulness is more important than fame. It's not about looking for recognition or rewards. It's about doing what you believe is right because it's right.
I love that. I mean, that's such a relevant message for us today, especially with everyone being so obsessed with social media and, getting likes and all that.
Oh, absolutely.
It's a good reminder that real satisfaction comes from living a life that's true to your values, whether anyone's watching or not.
Exactly. It's about finding that joy in the journey, the small acts of kindness and service, those quiet moments of connection with something bigger than ourselves.
Yeah, and that's what makes Ananias' story so compelling, right? Here's this seemingly ordinary guy who steps out in faith despite his fear. And by doing that, he sets off this chain of events that changes history.
And while we might not all be called to heal future apostles, we all have these Ananias moments.
Oh, yeah.
Those times when we're faced with a choice. Stay comfortable and safe, or step into the unknown and just trust that something good will come from it.
You know what really strikes me is how his hesitation actually makes the story even more powerful. Like, it would be easy to just see him as blindly obeying.
Right.
But the fact that he questions God,
Right.
that he actually voices his doubts and fears, it makes his act of faith so much more meaningful.
Yeah, I agree. It reminds us that doubt is a natural part of faith. It's not about getting rid of our doubts completely, but it's about choosing to trust in spite of them.
So going back to the sermon for a second, I'm curious about this analogy with the SpaceX Dragon launch and the International Space Station.
Yeah.
How does the pastor connect that to Ananias' story?
Oh, that's interesting. So the sermon describes God as the control center, like orchestrating the meeting of Ananias and Saul, just like mission control guides the Dragon spacecraft to the ISS. It's a way of saying that there's this bigger plan at work, right?
Something we can't always understand in the moment.
Okay. I can see how that metaphor could be powerful. But I'm wondering, instead of just focusing on this external control center idea, could we also look at the internal struggle that Ananias must have been going through?
That's a good point. The text definitely shows his internal conflict, the fear, the doubt, maybe even anger at being asked to do something so dangerous. And it's precisely that inner turmoil that makes his obedience so powerful.
Right.
He didn't just follow orders. He chose to trust, even when everything inside him was telling him to run the other way.
And this is where it gets really interesting, right?
Yeah.
Because it makes us think about the psychology and emotional side of faith.
Absolutely.
Like what happens inside of us when we're called to step outside our comfort zones? How do we overcome those instincts to protect ourselves?
It's about recognizing that faith often requires us to face those fears head on. It's about choosing to believe, even when it seems illogical or maybe even dangerous.
Right.
And, that's not easy. It takes a lot of courage.
Oh, for sure. And a willingness to be vulnerable, to step into the unknown, even with the possibility of failure or rejection or even harm.
And yet the sermon, through Ananias' example, is suggesting that these acts of courage, of choosing faith over fear, are what can lead to the most unexpected and amazing outcomes, outcomes that we might not even live to see, like Ananias himself.
Exactly. And it brings us back to that message of faithfulness over fame. Ananias wasn't looking for recognition or a reward. He acted on what he thought was right, even when it was terrifying. And by doing so, he changed the course of history.
It's pretty humbling when you think about it, that this seemingly ordinary man, driven by faith and a sense of duty, could have such a huge impact on the world.
It really is. It's a powerful reminder that we all have the potential to make a difference. We may not all be called to these grand historical things, but we each have a role to play in the story of humanity. And like the sermon says, it's often those seemingly small acts of faithfulness, of courage, of kindness that leave the most lasting mark on the world.
That's a really beautiful thought. It makes me wonder, what are those small acts of faith or courage that we're being called to today? What are those chances for us to step outside our comfort zones and make a positive impact, even if it's in ways we might not see or understand right away?
And maybe even more importantly, how can we develop that spirit of faithfulness in our everyday lives? Not for recognition or reward, but because it's the right thing to do.
Wow. It's amazing how we started with this seemingly simple story about this kind of obscure biblical figure, Ananias, and now we're here talking about the core of faith, courage, and our own potential to make a real difference.
It really shows you the power of these ancient stories. They can still speak to us today in such a relevant way.
And the sermon does a great job of weaving together Ananias' story with 1:6 life. It's like highlighting that we can all live out that same kind of faithfulness in our own way.
Yeah,
It's not about trying to be like these super famous figures from the past. It's more about realizing that we all have the potential to make a difference, even if it seems small or insignificant at first.
Right. It's like shifting our focus away from those big achievements and embracing the everyday chances to act with kindness, integrity, and compassion.
Yeah, those little choices we make every day. Like when we choose to step outside our comfort zones, or lend a helping hand, or speak up for what's right even when it's hard.
Exactly.
That reminds me of what you were saying earlier about Juji. It's not just about our own personal struggles. It's about taking a stand for what we believe in, even when it's tough, and doing it to make our communities and the world a better place.
Absolutely. And that's a really powerful message, especially in a world that can feel so overwhelming sometimes.
Yeah, totally.
It's a reminder that we're not helpless. Every single one of us has the power to contribute to positive change, no matter how small our actions might seem.
It's really striking to me that Ananias never actually saw the full impact of what he did. He listened to God, he healed Saul, and then he basically disappears from the story. But his act of obedience had this ripple effect that we're still talking about today.
Yeah, that's so true. It makes us think about impact in a whole new way. It's not always about seeing immediate results or getting recognition. Sometimes the biggest impact happens over time in ways we can't even imagine.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I feel like we're walking away with more than just information about an old story. It's like we've been given a challenge,
Yeah,
a call to action.
absolutely. The question we should all be asking ourselves is, what seemingly small act of obedience or faith are we being called to do today? What step can we take, no matter how insignificant it might seem, that could set off a positive chain reaction in the world around us?
And I think that's a pretty awesome note to end on. It's an invitation to live our lives with purpose, knowing that even our smallest actions can have huge consequences. It's a reminder to embrace those Ananias moments. Choose faith over fear, kindness over indifference, and action over apathy.
It's about recognizing that we're all connected to something bigger than ourselves, and that each one of us has a unique and important contribution to make.
Yeah.
So as you go about your day, listener, remember Ananias and ask yourself, what will be your small act of faith today?
And that's a wrap on our deep dive into the unexpected influence of Ananias. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, keep diving deep.